Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Gabe. Hey, today I want to talk about one of my favorite tools in Excel, and that is pivot tables. I find pivot tables to be incredibly helpful when you are looking to do sort of one off analysis on large data sets, especially, and want to just get a better understanding of, just a really quick way to kind of slice and dice data in a bunch of different ways. I've got an example pulled up on my screen here. This is just some made up example data from one of our demonstration systems that I'm going to use to just create a couple of pivot tables. So the first thing that you'll want to do is you will want to, if you're using the mouse, which as we talked about last time, don't use the mouse because it's a gigantic time suck. But if you are using the mouse, you can come up here under insert and click on pivot table and then click on the data range thing there. If you want to use your keyboard shortcuts, what you'll want to do is you want to hit Alt D P, and that will take you to that same form or same wizard, I should say. Once we're here, we need to tell Excel, well, what data do we want to analyze? Usually, I would say 99.9% of the time, you're going to be analyzing Microsoft Excel list or database. There could be times where you want to maybe look at an external data source or something like that. I would also say 90+% of the time, you will want to be doing a pivot table. I'm not a huge fan of pivot charts. I do really like charts in Excel, and we can talk about that in a future video as well. I find pivot charts to be very rigid from a flexibility perspective. And so I'm not personally a huge fan of them. I typically like to take my data out of a pivot table. And if I'm going to put it into a chart, I'll do that separately. But you can do pivot charts if that is something that you want to look at. Here for this example, I'm just going to click on pivot table. We're going to click next. Excel is usually smart enough to recognize that you have a large data set here that you want to analyze. So it's going to select the range of information that you want to analyze. And like I said, it's usually smart enough to just say, oh, okay, I have this table. This is what I want to look at. If you did want to select a different range, you could always, click and just drag across that. In this example, I'm going to go ahead and just select all of the data set and we'll click next. And then we need to tell our pivot table where we want it to go. Is it going to go into a new worksheet, which I would say you're going to do most of the time? If you do want to insert a pivot table into an existing worksheet, you would click on that and then just select the cell of where you want to put the pivot. For the purposes of this example, I'm just going to go with a new worksheet and I'm going to click finish. So now we have a pivot table. And we see that there's a couple of additional things that now are available in our ribbon, which is the pivot table, analyze, and design. This is the one area where you do kind of have to use the mouse, which makes me sad because I hate using it. But when you're creating a pivot table, it's generally pretty helpful to have the mouse and to select your fields from over here. So let's say that I wanted to look at a distribution of my customers by service tier as an example. I can take that downstream speed, that's the speed listed here, put that in the row, and I could grab, I'm going to say the name, and it's going to do a count of the name here. Now, Excel is going to try and do its best to figure out what value it should be using here or what method. So if it's a name, it's going to do count. If it's a number, as an example, let's just pull in service limit hits. It will use the sum. So it's going to try and recognize, is this a number? Is this a name? What is it that I want to visualize here? So, and you can always change that here as well, just by clicking on the actual field there. Click on view field settings and you can change it. So you can do sums, you can do counts. I do averages a lot as well. Max and min actually can be really helpful here too, but I would say the ones that I use probably most commonly are sums, counts, and averages. Averages I have found to be very helpful when you're doing this sort of one-off analysis as well. So now I have a count. So I've got 998 records, and here's the distribution by the various service tiers. Maybe I want to add some additional filters on here. So maybe I want to say, you know what, I only want to look at customers who are being served by fiber technology, and I only want to look at residential customers. I can just click and drag those fields into a filter up at the top and then select those like I would any other filter that's, in any other Excel filter. You can also select multiple items. This isn't a great example. Let me see if I can find a better example of this. Maybe we'll do USOC. So maybe there's additional tons of different billing codes. If I wanted to select multiple, I could just select a few here, or I could select them all and uncheck the ones that I don't want to look at. So there's a lot of flexibility there from a filtering perspective directly in the pivot table as well. You also can put information in the columns. So if we wanted to say, I wanted all of the information for business versus residential, and I wanted that broken out into two different columns, I could easily just throw that in the column and it breaks it out there as well. One other thing I will say about Excel, it defaults to this format, and I'm kind of old school. I don't love this format. So typically what I do is I like to come up here under design, and I like to go just to kind of the basic, the like super basic pivot table here. I also like to show it in tabular form. And the reason for that is if you add multiple rows here, then each one will show as a separate column. Whereas if you had it in the outline format, it to me just looks a little bit funky, and I'm not a huge fan of that. I think it's much easier to see it as separate columns. One other thing you'll notice with pivot tables when you have multiple columns is that there will be totals listed here. You don't have to have the totals. And if you want to get rid of them, you can right click and you can just click on this subtotal and it will remove them. So sometimes you'll want them. Sometimes you may want to see the totals. Sometimes you'll want to get rid of them. Since we're talking about this, one of the things that, one of my favorite little tips in Excel is oftentimes you'll find that you have blank cells that need to be completed. And this isn't such a big deal because there's not a huge list, but if this was a much larger list that had a bunch of blanks in it, there's a really easy way to just fill in those blanks. You click Control G, which takes you to the go-to menu. Click on Special and click on Blanks. And then you say equals the cell directly above the cell that you're in. So just hit the up arrow, hit enter, and then hit Control B, which is going to fill down. And it automatically will fill in all of the blank cells. Now, again, in that example where there's only 4 blanks, probably not that big a deal, but where you have a big list of data that has many blanks in the middle, that can be a really helpful way to just fill in those blanks. So a little bit of a divergence from the pivot table topic, but I just wanted to mention that because it's one of my favorite tips, just kind of random tips in Excel. Okay, back to pivot tables. So there's just a ton of flexibility here that I love around filtering, around showing the data in different ways. Let me put my customer type back up there. As I mentioned, you can do, if I wanted to pull in usage as an example and change this to an average, I could see what the average usage is, by service tier. There's just tons of flexibility here that you can do from a, kind of one-off data analytics perspective with pivot tables that I find incredibly helpful. I'll talk about some of more of the advanced stuff that you can do with pivot tables in maybe a future video, but I hope that gives folks a quick overview of how they could think about using pivot tables to do this kind of one-off analysis. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Always happy to chat. Thanks. Have a great day.